Okay. So we're going to be talking about the Black Death today, or the bubonic plague that took place during the Middle Ages. It was a pretty important event that took place, but it only lasted about 4 years, which is not a very long time period. And in that amount of time, half the people in Europe are going to die from the plague. So it was a pretty serious event that took place in the Middle Ages. So spreading throughout Europe during the mid-14th century, the Black Death had disastrous social and economic effects on everybody in Europe. All right, so let's just talk about a few things to remember. People during the Middle Ages were put into 3 categories. You were either people who fight, people who pray, or people who work. The people who fight were the nobles and the knights. The people who pray were the priests, the monks, and the nuns. And the people who work was everyone else. And that was about 90% of the population that were workers. But as we go through the Middle Ages, a new group is going to emerge called the merchant traders. These people are technically from the people who work category, but they had enough money to have land and possessions and clothes of the nobles and the knights. So we're introducing the middle class. This is the first time we've had a middle class. And remember, we drew a manor system a couple weeks ago. Everybody lived on manors. The houses and the shops were very close together. They're made of hay and mud and wood with thatch roofs, which means kind of a cross section of hay and mud. Animals lived nearby, and sometimes they even lived in the houses with people. And hygiene during this time was very limited. They had no running water, no soap, no indoor bathrooms, so people didn't bathe very often. So the bubonic plague, which is what we're going to call it, is spread by black rats that were infested with fleas. The fleas were carrying the Y. pestis bacteria. We also call this the Oncidium pestis. It infects the flea by blocking its stomach. The flea will repeatedly try to feed, so it's going to keep biting and trying to feed, but the blockage is going to cause it to regurgitate, that means throw up, bacilli, which is the bacteria, back into the host. So the fleas actually have the bacteria that causes the plague. They bite the rat or the person or the animal, and then they throw up the plague back into the person. So when the host dies, the flea then seeks a new host. The flea just jumps off from one animal or rat or person and goes to another. No one knew during the Middle Ages that it was spread by fleas and rats. They had no idea. Fleas and rats were really common in houses and shops, on ships, everywhere. And because their roofs are made of thatch roofs, this is a perfect breeding ground for fleas. So we know that the disease was spread along trade routes, as rats with fleas were always on ships. When they docked somewhere to stop and trade, every day the rats would come off and on the ship and infect the town completely, because as they were running around the town, the fleas would jump off onto humans and onto other animals. Clean rats would get on the ship and they would get the fleas, so it was just kind of a rotating door of fleas and rats off those ships. And a single bite from a flea could infect your body. This is the map of Europe. This is England up here. Okay, we have Spain down here, France is over here, Germany. So you can see this is the trade routes. So you can see that no matter where you live, because all this trading is going on everywhere, all these ships are landing, all these traders are traveling, the disease is going to spread very, very quickly. Throughout all of Europe is going to be infected with this disease. So there's actually 3 types of plague. The first type is called the bubonic plague, and that's the one that you get by the bites from the infected fleas. And it moves to your lymph nodes, which are located in your neck, in your armpits, and on your groin area. And then it quickly multiplies and forms growths called buboes. The buboes can be as big as an orange, and they're black. And when you cut them open, the blood that comes out of them is black and thick and kind of has this greenish scum with a really bad smell. Patients would also get fever, chills, and weakness all within 3 to 7 days of being exposed to it. The mortality rate was pretty extreme, as far as 30 to 75%, and that depended on where you lived and kind of the hygiene of that area. So these are pictures of the buboes. These are actual photographs of people who have gotten the plague in the last 100 years. And the buboes, as you can see, they're very painful. The first couple of days when they're filled with the white pus area, they're very painful. Once they turn black and they burst, that's also incredibly painful. This is a painting from the Middle Ages that shows two people that are completely covered in the buboes. The second type of plague that was associated with this is the pneumonic plague. This is a lung infection that causes the victim to cough up blood, and then that spreads the bacteria from person to person. So very similar to what we're experiencing now with our pandemic, it can go through the air. It's airborne droplets. So within 1 to 3 days of the person being exposed, they're going to experience shortness of breath, a cough with blood, chest pain, weakness, fever, and delirium. The mortality rate for this is 90 to 95% of people that die from this type of the plague. So if you're going to get a type of the plague, you definitely want to get the bubonic because the pneumonic plague was almost always fatal. The third type of the plague, which was the worst, was the septicemic plague, and this is a blood infection. And generally, they do not get buboes with this type of plague. Instead, they have chills, fever, bleeding under the skin, abdominal pain, septic shock. People were exhausted. They just wanted to go straight to sleep. If you went to sleep, you were not going to wake up. It is 100% fatal. Everybody who gets this type of plague dies, and that's still the case today. We have medicine and a cure for the bubonic plague and the pneumonic plague. We have no cure for the septicemic plague because it's a blood infection. So once it's in your blood, there's nothing they can do. This is also the type of plague that results in your extremities, like your fingers and toes, turning black. And that's because since it's a blood infection, your blood is infected and it doesn't circulate to the tips of your fingers and toes. So in 4 years of the plague, almost half of the population in Europe is dead. So 75 million people are dead within just 4 years time period. That's a lot of people. So what did they do when the plague started? Well, the wealthy people are going to flee to the countryside because they felt they were safer if it wasn't crowded. That is true that you are safer if it's not crowded. However, in the countryside, you have animals. So there's going to be more fleas and more spread of the disease in the countryside than in the cities. Families are going to abandon one another because of fear. One of the quotes from a writer during this time period, Bocello, said, "Terror was struck in the hearts of men and women. Brother abandoned brother, uncle his nephew, sister her brother, and very often wife her husband. What is even worse and nearly incredible is that fathers and mothers refused to see and tend to their children and left them to die as if they were not their own." So in Italy, 60% of the country is dead within the first year. In Venice alone, which is a city in Italy, 600 people die a day. In England and Germany, entire villages completely disappear as every person in the village dies. In Spain, 65% of the population dies. So one of the questions we have is, how do you bury 10,000 people in a city? You know, who's going to do the burial? No one wants to do the burial because they don't want to contract the disease. And we have piles and piles every single day of rotting bodies in layers, even in the rivers. And this is becoming a pretty big problem. And it also contributes to the spread of the disease. So this is when they start using coffins. They'd never used coffins before the Black Death. They start using coffins to try and stop the spread of the disease and the smell of the bodies. But eventually they don't have enough land for everybody who's dying, so they start digging mass graves in cities, on church grounds, and putting hundreds of bodies into one mass grave. So what's the church doing during all this? The priest refused to do last rites to the dying because they don't want to get sick themselves. And without last rites, Christians believe they cannot go to heaven. A lot of people believe the plague was a punishment from God for the sins of the Middle Ages, but the priests were dying too, so that really doesn't make a lot of sense. The Pope tells everybody, okay, if you can't go to church, you should confess your sins to each other and not rely so much on priests. But a lot of people are going to start to question their faith because they're thinking, if I'm a good person and this is a punishment from God, why am I sick? Why are the people I love sick? Why are children sick? And so the church is really going to lose a lot of its power that we talked about last week and the week before that it was building up during the Middle Ages. Many people wanted someone to blame for the death and despair that they were experiencing, so they turned on the Jews. The Jews were blamed and killed in the thousands. They were tortured, they were buried alive. People said the Jews were poisoning the water to kill Christians, but that doesn't make any sense because Jews, Muslims, Christians, everybody was dying from the plague. So why would the Jews poison the water and then kill themselves? So that doesn't make a lot of sense. As a result, they started forcing confessions from Jews. In one city in Germany, Strasbourg, Germany, all the Jews there were given a choice. They could either convert to Christianity or be burned alive. And they burned alive 2,000 people in one day who refused to convert to a different religion. So, as far as the medical response, doctors don't know what to do with this disease. They don't have a lot of knowledge at this time in the Middle Ages of how the body works. So even doctors stop seeing patients because they don't want to get the disease. A lot of the doctors believed that bad smells could drive the plague out of your body, so they would use dung or urine. Dung is like animal waste, poop, or urine as ingredients in the treatments, which was more likely to spread the disease than it was to cure it. But because they were so motivated to try and cure the disease and treat it, it is going to push the medical field forward towards using more of a scientific method and change the way we think about our bodies and diseases. This here is a picture of a typical doctor during the plague. So they would wear a mask that had the beak so that there was mesh over this area. They could breathe, kind of like the masks we wear now, but the beak was there so that the air hole wasn't close to their mouth. They wore a leather hat with leather gloves, leather boots, leather jacket, because they felt like they could keep the fleas out if they were completely covered. And they carried a wooden stick with them because as they would walk to go treat someone, there were hundreds of people in the street who were calling out for help and trying to grab the doctor and saying, please help me. And he would have to kind of fight them off with the stick. So if you look up here, you can see some of the treatments that they tried. They told people carry flowers or wear perfume and that the smells would ward off the disease. It did nothing. They told them to drink hot liquids, so they thought that would sweat out the disease, and that did nothing. They told them to carry a lucky charm, and this is actually where the rabbit's foot was started because rabbits did not contract the plague, so people thought if they carried a foot with them from a rabbit, they wouldn't get the plague. A lot of times they use leeches to bleed the victim, so they'd put it all over your body hoping to pull the infection out through your blood. That didn't work. They told them to smoke a pipe of tobacco and that the smoke would get rid of the disease. That didn't work. They would give patients a strong dose of laxatives so that they would have a bowel movement, and this would cause the patient to completely empty their bowels, and oftentimes that killed the patient because it dehydrated them. But the worst treatment probably was when they would coat the victim with mercury and place them in an oven, and they thought that would the heat and the mercury would kill off the disease. When in actuality, they would either die in the oven or die from serious burns. Don't ever get into an oven, ever, even if a doctor tells you it's going to cure your disease, because it will not. So before the plague, we had a lot of art, we had a lot of musical. It was cheerful, it was happy, but during the plague, music and art is going to become very dark and gloomy, which makes sense because the artists are writing things about what they see around them. So if all you see around you is sorrow, death, and misery, then that's what you're going to paint or draw. That's what you're going to sing about. And so we have a really dark time period here for music and art. This is a couple of the pictures from that time period. Skeletons became really common because they represented death, obviously. And so the idea that just the skeletons were around to have a life because everybody else was dead. This is a painting of Strasbourg, Germany, where they were killing the Jews who refused to convert. This one here is actually really interesting because you can see all the chaos that's going on. You can see the bodies that are piled up, dogs over here that are emaciated, really skinny because no one's taking care of animals because everybody's sick. People that are trying to escape the plague by going in the water. Cities that are burning down. Oftentimes, if people found out that someone in your household had the plague, they would board up your house and just light it on fire with everybody inside to prevent you from spreading it to other places. So it was a really dark and scary time for people to be alive. So the effects of the plague. I want you to remember something. Everything I discuss on this list is affected by the fact that pretty much everybody is dead from the plague, okay? So trade is going to decrease. Why? Because there's no one to trade with, no one to make the stuff, no one to trade to buy the stuff, because everybody's dead. Less demand for food or less demand for work. Why? Because there's no one to grow any food, no one to sell the food, no one to eat the food, because pretty much everybody's dead. Labor shortages. There's no one to work, no one to hire you, no one to buy what you're growing anyway. So this is actually going to give some power to the people who survive the plague. They can actually demand more money for their labor because, like I said, everybody's dead. You get the idea. So it's going to completely crash that system of feudalism that we had before, where people were peasants and stuck on the land. Because with everybody dead, they can go to any farmer and they can demand more money and they can get their own land. So feudalism is not going to survive the plague. So your assignment for tomorrow, and you guys can start working on it today, is that you're going to create a piece of artwork from the Black Death era, okay? So think about the visuals that I showed you. Skeletons are common, coffins are common. You can draw the rats that we talked about or the fleas. You can draw some of the treatment, the fact that they tried to use Lucky Charms or perfumes or flowers. So I want you to be creative and come up with something. I strongly encourage you to go to Google, type in Black Death, and look at the images, because you'll see hundreds and hundreds of images of what was going on during that time, and it'll give you some ideas of what you can create for your art piece, okay? This is going to be due by tomorrow at the end of the day. So you have the rest of the day today to work on this, and tomorrow. If you are physically in the classroom, feel free to get some paper, some black crayons or dark colors and things like that from the art supplies. And if you're at home, just get as creative as you can as far as using paper and pencil. It doesn't have to be colored because it's the Black Death, so don't make it look happy and colorful, okay?